All right. So we learned a little bit about Mendel and kind of how he did his work in pea plants. So now we're going to get down to the nitty gritty of exactly what he did. So first we're going to look at inheritance of single traits. And remember, for Mendel, trait is equivalent to the word we use, which is gene. So we're going to look at how single genes are inherited. Mendel started all his experiments with organisms that were true breeding. And what that means is that if they're allowed to self-fertilize, which is kind of how pea plants normally do it, they will only produce organisms that have the same traits. So the traits will remain unchanged in the offspring. So if you have a purple plant with purple flowers, if you let it self-fertilize, it will only produce plants with purple flowers. Okay, so that's an example of a true breeding plant. When Mendel did his cross-fertilization, so when he took his little paintbrush and took the pollen from one and put it on the the carpel of another, he used these true breeding plants. Okay, so he cross-fertilized true breeding white-flowered plants with true breeding purple-flowered plants. Okay. Now, the parents, those true breeding plants, are called the parental generation or the P generation. Okay. The offspring of the P generation cross are members of the first filial or F1 generation. And then offspring, if you let the F1 generation self-fertilize, they are called the second filial or F2 generation. Okay, and that's just some terminology, right? So we have the parental generation, their offspring is called the F1 generation. If we cross the F1 generation, their offspring is called the F2 generation. Oh, here we go. So pollen from either a true breeding purple flowered plant or a true breeding white flowered plant is used to cross-fertilize a plant of the other type. Again, this is our parental generation or our P generation. Okay. And then the offspring of that generation is called the first generation or the first filial or F1 generation. And when Mendel made this cross, what he found is that every offspring of when you crossed a true breeding purple plant with a true breeding white plant, all the offspring have purple flowers. So what this meant, there was really two options. So either the gene for the white flower or the allele for the white flower kind of went away, or is somehow being masked. So in order to figure out if the gene for the white flower went away or if it was just being hidden, Mendel took two members of the F1 generation. So he took an F1 and allowed it to self-fertilize, so fertilize itself, and got an F2 generation. So let's look at that. So Mendel took the F1 generation and allowed it to self-fertilize. And then the offspring in the F2 generation had 3/4 purple flowered plants and 1/4 white flowered plants. Aha! Our white plant is back in a ratio of 3:1. And so the results showed that the white trait hadn't just disappeared in the F1 generation, but it was hidden or masked. And this is how Mendel started to figure out his law of dominance. Okay, and we'll get more on that in a minute. So, and then this is just kind of looking at the picture again. So we have our F1 plant. We allow it to self-fertilize. And in the second generation or the F2 generation, 3/4 of the offspring were purple and 1/4 of the offspring was white. All right, so what does this mean? So we're going to start to look at the dominant versus recessive versions or alleles of our genes, okay? And how these genes move. And remember, these genes are on homologous chromosomes. So the two alleles of the genes are on homologous chromosomes. And you have to remember how homologous chromosomes move during meiosis in order to explain how these alleles are inherited. So don't forget your meiosis. So we have a very short 5-part hypothesis that explains the inheritance of these single traits or genes. Okay. So number 1, each trait is determined by a pair of genes. So every organism has 2 alleles for each gene. One is on each homologous chromosome. Okay. So if I have a pair of homologous chromosomes, and remember they have the same genes in the same places on the chromosomes. All right. Number 2, when there are 2 different alleles present in an organism, if there's a dominant allele, it can mask the recessive allele. And this feels like a good time for me to define dominant versus recessive. Okay, so dominant allele, if present, okay, will be expressed. Okay, so if there is any dominant allele, if there's 2 dominant alleles, obviously it's the only one there and it'll be expressed. And if there's only 1 dominant allele, it will still be expressed even if the other one is recessive. Okay, a recessive allele is only expressed if it is the only allele present. Okay, so in our peas, obviously the purple flower trait is dominant to the white flower trait. Okay, and this kind of explains how that white trait can be hidden, because if there's any dominant allele present, if the purple allele is present, you're going to see purple flowers. The only time you see the recessive allele, the white flower, is if it's the only allele present. Okay, so that's our dominant versus recessive. Okay, so continuing with our hypothesis, number 3, these pairs of alleles are on homologous chromosomes are separated, of course, during meiosis, when the homologous pairs are separated during anaphase 1 of meiosis 1. The separation of these alleles is called the law of segregation. Okay, and Mendel has 2 laws. He's got the law of independent assortment, which we already know about. Okay, chromosomes assorting independently, lining up on the metaphase plate independent of each other. And then that is followed by the law of segregation, which says when the homologous pairs are separated during anaphase 1 of meiosis 1, it's random which allele gets segregated into which gamete. Okay, and that goes along with point 4, which is this is all again determined by chance. It's independent. So chance determines which allele is included in a given gamete because the homologous chromosomes separate randomly during meiosis because they line up randomly. So independent assortment and segregation go hand in hand. Okay, so the distribution of alleles into the gametes is also completely random. And 5, we're talking about homozygous versus heterozygous. True breeding organisms, okay, organisms that will self-fertilize and make only the same characters as the parent, have 2 copies of the same allele for any given gene. And this is called homozygous. So homozygous, okay, have 2 of the same alleles. I'm having serious spelling issues here. 2 of the same allele for a gene, okay, in the zygote, okay? Heterozygous have two different alleles for a gene in the zygote. Okay, homo means the same, hetero means different. Okay, and here's an example of how that works. If I have a homozygous parent, it has two of the same alleles. Both of these alleles are purple, as you see, the little purple band. So when these alleles are separated in meiosis, okay, to make gametes, meiosis 1, each gamete gets the gametes have the same alleles because there's only one possible allele. Okay, so you have gametes with the same allele for that gene. If you have a parent that's heterozygous, you have two different alleles of the gene at that locus. Okay, so when you separate the homologs in meiosis 1, okay, half the gametes will get one allele and half the gametes will get the other allele. Okay, so we're going to use a lot of these concepts. This is again the law of segregation. Law of segregation. Okay, and actually, just while I have you here, if you have this parent here, because it only has one type of allele present and it's a dominant allele, of course, the dominant allele will be expressed, which would be purple. In a heterozygous parent, there's two different alleles, but there's a copy of the dominant allele present, so this parent would also be purple. Okay, in order to get a white flowered plant, you'd have to have two copies of the recessive allele. So you'd have to have a parent that was homozygous, but homozygous for the recessive allele. Okay, two copies of the recessive allele. That's the only way you get a recessive. Okay? All right. That is all. That's all, folks. Okay? Go watch part 2. This was part 1. Go watch part 2. Go. Go do it now. Click it. Go. Go get it.